Welcome back to Uplift. Joining me this week is Dr. Greg Pike, a research fellow at the BioEthicist Centre, all the way from Adelaide in Australia. Thank you, Dr. Greg, for joining me all the way from Australia today. It's been great to see you in person. So I want to ask you, what are the ways in which women might experience coerced abortion, and who are the perpetrators, and what form might the coercion take?
I think we need to cast the idea of coercion in a really broad context, and part of the reason for that is that it depends on the vulnerability of the person involved. So if someone who's in a particularly vulnerable situation will find that a certain level of coercion will be quite potent for them, whereas for another it might not be. So we need to have that breadth and think about coercion in terms of pressure and influence, right from the what might be called softer levels, right through to more serious threats and so on. So it could take the kind of form that you read some of these statements that women make, and they're really quite confronting. So some can be, "I'll kill you if you don't have the abortion." So there's horrible threats like that, or being kicked out of home is not an uncommon experience. In fact, I think that kind of idea of being kicked out of home, which was something that happened in the past with adoption, interestingly, a young woman gets pregnant. If you don't adopt this child out, you're out. But intimate partners, of course, also are involved in the coercion. So one particular quote I remember was that a young girl said she was excited about being pregnant, and she said to her mum, "I'm pregnant." And the mother's immediate response was, "Well, I hope you're getting rid of it because you'll make a terrible mother." So those sorts of things can have profound impact. So I think there's that, which is more direct from family, partners and so on. But at another level, there's something that can happen at a cultural level. Once particular practices become embedded in the community, people can be influenced by that. So they can perceive that the right thing to do is get rid of, if you're a young teenager, for example, the right thing to do, you can't possibly be a good parent, so the right thing is this.
Yeah, and how common is coerced abortion?
I think this is one of the difficulties we have. There's a lot of research that runs back 20, 30 years, which surveys women and asks them why they chose to have abortion. And that's when these stories of pressure come up, and depends a little on how you ask the question. But there's some research to show that, one particular one I'm thinking of, which was US women and Russian women, that 64% of the US cohort said they'd been pressured into their abortion, and about 37% of the Russian cohort. But it does vary significantly, but we probably can realistically say that something around the 20, 30, 40% figure of women say that they were pressured into having the abortion, and under different circumstances they would have gone ahead and kept their child.
Okay, and you've argued that coerced abortion needs to be understood in a broader context.
Yeah.
What is that context, and why is it important?
Yes, many people here would have seen the BBC Comres survey, and that survey was based around the term reproductive coercion. About 10 years ago, some researchers in the US first coined that term. And when they talk about reproductive coercion, they're thinking it in a really broad context, that it could be behaviours which are intended to promote pregnancy as well as avoid pregnancy. So in that sense, coerced abortion becomes a subset of reproductive coercion. And so, interestingly, from the BBC's survey, many of the headlines that appeared seemed to be focused almost exclusively on pregnancy promotion. And so abortion coercion didn't really get much airplay at all. And yet that BBC poll showed that 15% of women overall said that they'd been coerced into an abortion. The interesting thing about that too is that 15% figure needs to be understood in the broader context of how many women in the community will have an abortion. So that's only one small portion of the community. So that 15% could translate into something much larger amongst the women who actually have abortions. My personal view is that the focus on reproductive coercion, and particularly on pregnancy promoting behaviours, actually misses a lot of the problem. I think many people are so familiar with the idea that someone might become pregnant and then be pressured into having the abortion. That seems to make logical sense. The idea of being pressured into becoming pregnant is not that intuitively obvious, but there is certainly data to show that that happens. And that's where most of that emphasis has been.
And so research on reproductive coercion seems to identify with, different statistics about the common, about how common it is.
Yeah.
What types of coercion are predominant, and why is it?
Yeah. Here we get into the difficulty of the definitions. So if someone is coerced into becoming pregnant, that can come, as I was saying before, by threats and all sorts of things. But also included within the idea of reproductive coercion is things like hiding of contraceptives and phenomena of stealthing, secretive condom removal. So that particular behaviour might not be directed at all to becoming pregnant or coercing to become pregnant. There's another motivation altogether, and yet it's included in those figures, and so it actually is not uncommon at all for that particular behaviour. And so it kind of muddies the waters a little in trying to understand coercion to either become pregnant or to avoid pregnancy. So that's part of the confusion, and that particular behaviour, women report that at relatively high incidence, and the other behaviours at somewhat less. One thing that seems intuitively obvious here is that we're talking about women in the context of reproductive coercion. One of the earliest surveys surveyed men and women, and it asked the question about whether anyone has pressured them into pregnancy. So for a woman, have you been pressured into becoming pregnant? For the man, were you put in circumstances where you were pressured to get someone pregnant? Yeah. And the figures are roughly equivalent. So whilst we think about coercion into pregnancy primarily about women, it's also something which does affect men. And the business of reproductive coercion, more broadly speaking, is something that does affect men. But I do think, nevertheless, the focus is rightly on women.
Interesting. Some researchers have identified an association between abortion and intimate partner violence. Can you explain the nature of the relationship?
Yes. Intimate partner violence is connected, we say associated rather than causative, because the research can't really tell us what comes first, what comes after, although there's some which can show us something along those lines. But the association is that a history of IPV, intimate partner violence, is associated with doubling the chances of a second abortion and tripling the chances of a third abortion. So there's clearly a relationship, and researchers recognise that there is this link between abortion and intimate partner violence. Part of the way it can work is that in particularly violent relationships or really difficult, troubled relationships, men might be coercive into pregnancy just as much as they might be coercive to end the pregnancy. So they may actually want to actually engage in sexual behaviour, but then not want to live with the consequences. So they'll be just as coercive for the woman with regard to sexual coercion, and possibly even into becoming pregnant, and then either change their mind or behave in ways which are very coercive to get rid of the child. So I actually think it's an intriguing sort of thought process to think why it might be that intimate partner violence can actually increase after an abortion. And I wonder if that might be partly because of the violence of the act itself, the violence of abortion, promotes further violence, but at the same time, a woman who has been coerced into aborting the child that she really wants to keep is then going to carry the pain of that into the future relationship, and the relationship become more troubled and more potentially violent as a consequence of that.
So has coerced abortion been neglected by researchers, do you think?
I think it has, and I think if we look back, as I said earlier, we find all of that research specifically about coerced abortion. And that kind of was done all through the 80s, 90s and a little into the 2000s. But then with reproductive coercion coming along, coerced abortion dropped off the radar. And there are two key researchers in the States who kicked off the idea of reproductive coercion. Both of them are on the record for saying we don't need to think about the myth of coerced abortion, or it's not that coerced abortion could not occur, or we shouldn't focus on the minutiae of coerced abortion. What I think is going on there is that, and I know it does sound somewhat conspiratorial, but if the focus can be primarily upon coercion to become pregnant, then that shores up the need for dealing with that problem. So, as you'll be aware, the public sympathy, some of the public sympathy for abortion is highest when coercion has occurred. So rape, obviously, rape is one of those categories that the public generally says, oh yeah, that I might be opposed to abortion on a lot of grounds, but when it comes to rape and coercion, no, that's okay, I'll go that far. So we know that the public has some sympathy, and obviously they should have sympathy for a woman's circumstances where she's been coerced, but they have some sympathy for following that through with abortion. So I think if the business of reproductive coercion to become pregnant is made really prominent, then that kind of makes it more straightforward to say, well, we must have abortion then for all those circumstances. If we've got reproductive coercion going out of control, and from that BBC poll, the way it was in the media was a huge hidden problem. This is massive. Then you can't not have abortion. Yeah. On that argument. And so I do think that there has been somewhat of a strategy and an avoidance of talking about coerced abortion. Also because the pro-choice vision, if I can put it that way, is fully informed women making free choices about their reproductive future, and that they never are going to be in circumstances where they haven't chosen abortion freely. So when we raise the issue of coerced abortion, that means that we're actually giving voice to women who have been in circumstances where they really did want to keep a child. And in the US, for example, we have some legislation put in place specifically to address the problem of coerced abortion. And the pro-choice side does not like that.
Great, thank you, Dr. Greg Pike, for joining me in studio today. It was a pleasure chatting to you, and well done for speaking up for those who are most vulnerable and for the voiceless. Thank you.